we're going to start this session. I'm Christine, the session chair, and we're going to be hearing from Dr. Liz Shea today. She's the Senior Grants Development Consultant for Grants Office here in New York, and she specializes in helping higher ed institutions find and apply for grants, which she will tell us about now.
Thanks so much. So today I'm going to be talking about funding institutional innovation needs through grants. And I'm going to be talking about it from a U.S. perspective, since that's where my expertise lies, but know that the same kind of rules apply in lots of other countries around the world. So some of my specific examples might not necessarily apply to what you're working on, but the concepts will still apply in many, many different countries. So looking through things in the U.S., we have three major sources of grants funding. We have federal agencies. There's 26 federal grant-making agencies. Not everyone is relevant to learning and ideas related to that, but things like Department of Education, obviously, but also National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, Department of Labor, Department of Defense, NASA. Many different kinds of agencies do care about education or parts of education and can definitely be relevant. In the US, there's also state agencies. You can also have provincial agencies in Canada, for example, and other kinds of organizations in other countries. And they have their own priorities, and every state is a little bit different. So some states care a lot about learning and innovation in that space, and some states don't really care that much. But there's definitely some possibilities in that space as well, especially, say, Department of Education or Department of Labor. And then you have your private and corporate foundations. These are individuals who or families or corporations who are really interested in particular areas of focus. There are many who are interested in learning, workforce development, topics like that, that they put a lot of focus in, and they give their monies in the areas that they're interested in. So as we're talking through things in the higher education space, for example, we have areas that grant makers tend to care about, and many of these overlap with those kinds of learning ideas. So response to the COVID pandemic, being able to deal with transition to learning in different modes is definitely still a big area of interest. But we also have things like career readiness, workforce development, innovative education, infrastructure supporting faculty research. That actually falls into education sometimes too, since you need to educate your future researchers as well. Student retention, student diversity, campus safety sometimes falls into some education topics as well. But across the board, there's a lot of different areas that grant makers care about. And so it's thinking about those kinds of areas and how they connect to what you're working on that are really important to be able to find grant funding opportunities. So I know I just mentioned lots of different areas of grant makers in the higher education space, but I tend to think about there being three major focus areas for grant makers in the US. This is student learning, which is things like innovative teaching and learning experiences, increased involvement in in-demand fields. So thinking about increasing the number of students in STEM or something like that. And also increased diversity. So getting more traditionally underrepresented students into fields and entering those degree programs and graduating and entering careers in those fields. Also workforce development. This predominantly in the US falls to two-year institutions because of how grant makers tend to think about workforce development. But it's things like meeting local and regional labor demands, making sure the educational experiences you're providing are actually applicable and are actually helpful so that people can be hired. And then also upskilling and reskilling, I think, have become even more popular since the pandemic has come about, because it turns out it's really important that people can be prepared to meet the current labor demand, not necessarily what was going on 5 years ago, for example. So being able to get people who already have careers the additional skills they need to advance or to change careers. And then also wraparound services. We tend to think about the educational experience itself, but I think it's really important when you're thinking about these kinds of comprehensive projects to think about what else your students have going on, because a lot of them have families or jobs or other external demands. And so making sure that your projects are thinking about those kinds of components is also super important, and being able to, say, partner with another organization that could help provide daycare or rides to campus or whatever that might look like can also be really important. And then also faculty research, those innovative projects, especially in in-demand fields. We're seeing increased interest in, say, transportation and energy fields, for example, in the US, since that's kind of where we're heading as a society. And also shared use equipment that goes across a lot of different research labs. That last one is what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, and it does really connect to those educational needs as well. So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to give a few examples of federal grants in the United States that go across these different areas, as well as examples of funded projects. So no, obviously these are US examples, but similar programs exist in other countries. And also it's thinking creatively about how you would approach these kinds of projects and thinking about the kinds of things that grant makers tend to look for. So improving undergraduate STEM education in human resources comes out of the National Science Foundation. This program tends to be referred to as IUs. So if you hear that term, know that that's what that is. This program has 2 deadlines per year. The next one comes up on July 20th, so that's getting pretty close. But the one after that is in January, so you don't have to wait too long on that one. And when they talk about human resources at National Science Foundation, they don't mean what we think of as human resources as employees. They mean how do we get the workforce qualified to do the jobs that exist. That's what they mean in that case. So IUs is really all about those novel, creative, and transformative approaches for new knowledge about STEM teaching and learning and improving STEM education for undergraduate students. This is both 2-year and 4-year undergraduate students, but the key is it has to be undergraduate students for this particular program. There's 2 funding tracks under this program. The first is the Engaged Student Learning funding track. This one's really focused on design, development, and research of tools and resources and models to be able to further STEM education in either a teaching or learning or both kind of setting. So this is the kind of thing that we think about a lot in this kind of space. Those kind of innovative projects that get students more engaged and more excited about STEM topics, that's what they really care about. This kind of includes student initiatives, so think about that curriculum development kind of thing, but also faculty professional development. How do you get your educators to be better educators? And also research on teaching and learning more broadly. How do we do this effectively? And how do we make sure that students actually learn the skills that they need? And then we also have the institutional and community transformation track. This is focusing on those systematic changes. So you're thinking about completely redesigning how you approach STEM education at a departmental level or at a college level or at an institute of higher education level, or even more broadly, maybe all institutes in a state or all institutions in the STEM community more broadly. These are kind of large scale ideas, and it's completely redesigning things. So if you think of engaged student learning as transforming maybe a class or part of a class or maybe a couple classes in some cases, institutional and community transformation is really about rethinking much more broadly how you approach STEM education. So maybe you want to create an entirely new major or design an entirely new course sequence. That's the kind of thing that falls under this particular program. Or maybe you just want to think about STEM learning in a completely different way than how we do it right now. That also would fall under this particular track. So this program has an RFP, which is request for proposal, out now. So you can look at all the details. Obviously, I just gave you a very high-level overview of it. But funding ranges quite a bit on this particular program. It could be $150,000 up to $3 million for a 2 to 5 year project. So it depends on which of those 2 funding tracks I was talking about, as well as the scale of the project. So they don't want you making one module with $3 million, but transforming an entire STEM community, certainly $3 million would be very reasonable for that. Institutes of higher education are really your big applicants here because they're really the big kind of organization that's doing undergraduate STEM education, but also associated organizations. And we see some instances where there's maybe collaboration between different kinds of organizations. Your lead applicant needs to be a nonprofit, but it's really about that collaboration in many cases because people are bringing different kinds of expertise. So as an example of a project, the University of Wisconsin system recently got an IU's award. They got $563,000. And this is going to enable faculty to create more inclusive learning environments for their students. They're partnering with 7 universities and community colleges, and their goal is to incorporate research-based practices to enable students to develop those kind of like 21st century skills, and then also to persist in STEM fields. So their goal is to build a diverse network of trained facilitators. They're doing activities that kind of branch into, say, theater and other kind of arts fields to enable these facilitators and educators to be able to better engage students in their STEM experience. And they're trying to implement those inclusive practices so that Faculty members know how to meet the needs of their students, and anything that they're teaching is going to better fit with these students and be better examples and better ideas and things that the students actually care about, because they're more likely to actually learn. There's also a goal to help address some of those persistent gaps that we see in the rates of women and members of underrepresented groups persisting in STEM fields. And definitely a big component of that is that trying to be more inclusive in your educational experience, so that not everything is the same way it's always been, since that hasn't seemed to be working. Know that this is just one of many examples, so don't feel like this is the exact kind of project you would need to make if IU is a grant you're interested in, but definitely it's the kind of scope of the thing you're thinking about. So you're really looking at pushing that envelope. On the not so STEM side of things, we have another example of Humanities Connections. This actually comes out of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Their next deadline is September 1st, so now is a great time to be thinking about this program if it's something that you're interested in. This particular program is all about connecting departments and connecting faculty across departments and connecting students across departments. The goal is to take one humanities field and one non-humanities field. Typically, these are in the social or natural sciences, although there are some other exceptions that can be possibilities as well. But the goal is to develop that curriculum at that intersection. So there are lots of opportunities for faculty to collaborate, and also lots of opportunities for students to really learn things at that intersection. And then also they want to include experiential learning, because they know that that's a way that will actually get students engaged in the classroom. And they also want to know that any project you're proposing is going to last. So this is going to be a short-term grant, but how are you transforming your institution by including this kind of cross-departmental initiatives? So this RFP is also out, and you can look at it right now on the National Endowment for the Humanities website. The funding amounts are a little bit smaller than we tend to see in STEM. That tends to be what happens in humanities, probably because there's less technology typically included in these things. But you still get $35,000 to $100,000 for a 1 to 3 year project. So you can really get going at that intersection. A lot of times we see it as maybe a course or a sequence of courses are being developed at that intersection, but there's also other ways to approach it. This particular program is really for colleges and universities, since the goal is that kind of formal intersection between academic departments, but definitely collaboration happens as well. So, and it's another example of a project. Arizona State University recently got $100,000, and their project is for artificial intelligence in digital culture. So they're creating a certificate program for artificial intelligence and machine learning, looking at those humanistic and cultural engagement with artificial intelligence. So kind of making it seem more human and not just coding or numbers or something like that. This lets STEM students engage with that kind of critical thinking skills that are super important in the humanities, and get them thinking about things with those kind of humanities perspective, rather than always the logical focus that we tend to see in STEM departments. And this program is really about curriculum building, development of online modules, and community partnership for experiential learning, getting them out there and doing this for real, so that it's more than just an idea for them. They actually can see it happen in practice. So it's an opportunity to kind of connect the technical skills we see in the STEM side of things with those 21st century critical thinking kinds of skills that we see in the humanities. So I think very valuable kind of project, and I think that's just one way to approach this intersection between the humanities and the non-humanities fields, but definitely an opportunity, I think, for a lot of growth. So it's something to think about there. The workforce development space also has lots of grant options. So I'll give you a few examples in that space so we can see what that kind of looks like. So I'm going to start out with another National Science Foundation grant. They do a lot of different grant programs that are always very exciting to focus on the education space. This is the Advanced Technological Education Program, or ATE. The next deadline is on October 6th. So this particular program is all about STEM technician training. It's in lots of different fields, and you can see at the top of the screen some of those fields, things like biotech and engineering and computer science, but lots of different areas within the STEM space, but thinking more about the practical applications than necessarily the theoretical that we see in some kinds of STEM programs. This particular grant program supports lots of different kinds of things. So curriculum development is definitely a big area, but also thinking about your professional development, leadership capacity building, business and entrepreneurial skills for your students so that they're actually ready to go into the workforce, a very important thing. And then also the instrumentation acquisition. So how do you actually have the technology or other components that you need to implement these projects? This is primarily for two-year institutions. In fact, any project must include a two-year institution. But there's also opportunities at the intersection between high school and two-year institutions, or two-year institutions to four-year institutions, and developing that kind of pipeline there. One thing I do want to mention, this program has many different funding tracks. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's like 10, and that's going to take way too long. But one that I do want to highlight is small grants for institutions new to ATE. This particular program and funding track is just for community colleges who have never done ATE or really haven't done much with ATE. And it lets you prototype a project so that you can be in a more competitive position to apply for one of those other funding tracks to expand your project in the future. And you're also only competing against other community colleges who have never done this program before. So it's a real opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door at NSF in a way that doesn't make you compete against foreign institutions who do many millions of dollars a year with NSF. Also interesting to note, NSF realizes that it can be a little tricky sometimes to deal with their grants. So they have a program called Mentor Connect, which will pair an institution, if you're new to ATE, with an institution who's done it a bunch, and you now have a hands-on one-on-one mentorship opportunity. So that can be a big benefit if this is something you're interested in doing, because then you can kind of talk to somebody who's done it and be able to get that more hands-on connection than you could necessarily get just by watching all the webinars and all of the other things associated with this program. So this program also has the RFP out now, so you can already start getting ready. October feels like a long way from now, but it's really not once you get going. Funding varies from $75,000 to $600,000 for 2 to 3 years, depending on which funding track you go for. So again, quite a large range, and it's really dependent on the scope of the project that you're looking for. Those two-year institutions must take a leadership role in the project. So that's really important because that's where STEM technician training is happening. So you want to make sure that they're really closely involved, but also other institutes of higher education, businesses, and nonprofits can partner. So that's an opportunity to get some of that expertise that maybe the two-year institution doesn't have, whether it be the research questions around educational approaches, or maybe it's some technical components that you want a business to partner with, or maybe you want to provide wraparound services by partnering with a community nonprofit to help support there. Those are all the kinds of possibilities that you could think about. So as an example of a recently funded project, the Kentucky Community and Technical College System got about $556,000, and they are doing Industry 4.0 technologies using competency-based education. They're actually specifically recruiting for upskilling. So their goal is to get people to come back after they already have jobs and get some additional skills. And they have a bunch of partnerships with industry and other stakeholders so that they can make sure everything they're doing is super relevant for getting their students hired once they're done. So they're piloting this new approach, and they're going to revamp 7 of their advanced manufacturing courses. This goes towards 6 industry recognized certificates and 2 national certifications. So you know that it's really connected to things that are industry recognized, but they're also trying to make sure that it's as beneficial to students as possible. So you can see on the screen, there's a lot of different technical areas, things around fluid power and electrical motor controls and things like that. But they're really focusing on those kind of Industry 4.0. How do we teach what students are going to need in the future, not necessarily just about what do they need today to be successful. So this is the kind of project that you can propose for ATE. Again, not the only one. Just think about any of those STEM courses that you have. Advanced manufacturing is definitely popular, but also thinking about, say, IT or something like that can also be very beneficial in this kind of program, and getting those students trained to meet the needs of the future labor demand. And kind of going along with that, a Department of Labor grant, the Strengthening Community Colleges Training Grants. This program actually just had a deadline at the beginning of this month, but we already have the next one for October 14th. And this particular program is all about addressing the needs of employers in the local or regional area. So basically, it's all about revamping what you're doing as a curriculum to meet the needs of those employers so that you 100% are improving the economy of the area, but also making sure your students can get hired. The goal is to provide that skills training for those individuals and help them get from unemployment to employment or re-employment as quickly as possible. Any kind of accelerated career path is definitely a plus on this particular program, but also thinking about if it's an associate's degree, make sure they can actually finish that in 2 years and won't get stuck because of other challenges. And then also thinking about things like challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, developing learning experiences that students are actually excited about doing, and including those evidence-based education strategies, and then also actually collaborating with industry so that you know you're meeting what they actually need, not what you think they need. So this particular program, like all the other ones I've talked about so far, has an RFP out available now. This program is very large scale. Minimum award is 1.5 million. Maximum award, depending on the kind of applicant you are, is up to $5 million. It's a 2-year project. So definitely more ambitious and large scale than some of the ones we talked about. But it's an opportunity to kind of rethink maybe a whole department or a couple of departments within an institution and being able to meet those needs. This project must be led by a community college, has it in its name, so that one's not a surprise. But there's also mandatory collaboration with workforce development boards and employers, and there's encouraged collaboration with other institutes of higher education, community organizations, government units, things like that. So definitely all about having those collaborations and having a bunch of people at the table talking about what's really needed to meet those needs. So as an example of a project that's been funded, Broward College in Broward County, Florida, got almost $2 million, and their goal is to do micro-credentialing in higher education. I know in an earlier session today, we were talking a little bit about micro-credentialing and its benefits or not benefits, but their goal was to make it meet those local and regional labor demands. They focused on healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and information technology fields. That's really where the employers were in their area who had openings. And they partnered with workforce development boards, the State Department of Education, community-based organizations, municipalities, a bunch of employers, all sorts of different people had a seat at the table and provided their particular viewpoints. The goal was to develop a process for awarding these micro-credentials and badges using a digital platform. And the goal was also to support workforce education and apprenticeship programs that would lead to this micro-credentialing opportunity. So making sure that the students actually had the education that they needed to be able to get that kind of check mark that they did the micro-credential. They included a distance learning infrastructure in their project to kind of address that COVID pandemic issue that is going on. And also that helps meet those needs of the students since they don't have to commute and things like that all the time. And they also included outreach materials. So how do you actually find those students and get them into your program so that they can then learn the skills and get employed? So that was a big component of this project as well. So it's definitely thinking about more than just the curriculum innovation, but how do you deal with a whole comprehensive project that lets you rethink a department or a degree program or something like that at your institution so that you can be meeting those local and regional needs. And then the last of those sections that I'm going to be talking about is faculty research. And then I will move on to some other things that are not examples of grants. But when we talk about research projects, the big vast majority of research funding goes to individual research projects that individual faculty work on. And most faculty know more or less what the grants are that support their specific research. But there's also this chunk of grants called research instrumentation grants, and those are mysterious to a lot of people. So this is for shared use equipment, things like high performance computing, mass spectrometers, magnetic resonance imaging machines, things like that, stuff that's super expensive and no single faculty member could pay for. And there are a lot of different options at the federal government level. Predominantly, these are federally funded in the US, but it really depends on what the research focus is, what agency would be interested, and what specific program within that agency would make the most sense. I'm going to talk about the broadest of these programs today, which is the Major Research Instrumentation Grant out of the National Science Foundation. Just as an example, we expect to see the next deadline for this program in January of 2023. So definitely a little ways down the road, but always a good time to be thinking about it. The goal of this program is to fund a single piece of super expensive shared use research equipment. This can also be what's called an integrated instrument. So it's a bunch of pieces that only work when they work together. I think high performance computing is probably the most classic example of this. And it must be for science and or engineering usage, since that's what the National Science Foundation cares about. They care about all fields of science and engineering except for the medical sciences. But anything else they are interested in. And one of the really important keys is to know your use cases. So this particular program, on the surface, it's a research grant. So you have to think about, what are your researchers doing? What will be enabled by this particular piece of equipment that they can't do right now, or it's so slow that they can't actually further their field with this particular piece, without this equipment or something like that. But also important to think about are, what are the STEM education benefits? So how are you going to train more researchers this way so that they can do research? How are you going to expose undergraduates to what is actually happening in the cutting edge of their field? All of those kinds of things are also super important under these programs, and this one specifically. So we'll expect to see another RFP come out for this program in the fall with a deadline in January, and funding is $100,000 to $4 million, and a cost share of 30% is required for PhD granting institutes of higher education, no cost share for non-PhD granting institutions. And this is a one-year project. Basically, your goal is to just implement the piece of equipment and get it installed at your institution so that it can be used, and then you'll actually start using it at the end of the year. So institutes of higher education and other research organizations are the applicants that are eligible here. If you are not at a research organization, think about partnering with a research organization as a possibility. So maybe you provide a lot of education in your area in a relevant STEM field. Maybe you want to partner with a research university that's nearby and be able to better utilize the equipment so that you don't have a lot of downtime on it. So that would make you a more competitive applicant at that point. So as an example of a project, California State University Northridge got $455,000 to acquire its first mixed GPU-CPU high-performance computing cluster. Not that important to know exactly what that does, but the important part is that they're going to be able to enhance their STEM education so that they can facilitate existing and newly created courses, so that students will have more opportunities to actually be exposed to this kind of technology. They're also going to be able to expand the scope of research that's being conducted, because you can't do simulations that are super big and complicated on individual laptops or something like that. And they're going to be able to establish research programs that will broaden the number of diverse students who can participate in advanced materials research, helping to address those gaps that we see for women and traditionally underrepresented minorities in the STEM space, and get them more involved and that more hands-on experience, and hopefully get them to persist and complete their degrees and enter the fields. So this is, again, just one of many possible examples. But thinking about both those research applications and the education applications are really important for these kinds of grant programs. And thinking about that overall comprehensive project, how can you utilize what piece of equipment you want to its max? So with that, I will pause for a moment for questions. No questions? Do you have questions?
Only that, I mean, obviously those are like the reviews, but do you see the grant applications? Do you
So,
go to your office?
Yeah, so my office works with organizations who submit grant applications.
Right.
So we see things that are being submitted. Most federal agencies will not share applications that have been submitted because intellectual property issues, right? Especially in research and education spaces. But we can see the summaries and things like that. And also just working with lots of organizations, we kind of see that variety. But one thing to note is that, for example, National Science Foundation posts abstracts of each of their awarded projects, and many other agencies do as well. So you can kind of see that scope of what's awarded.
Most institutions have grant writers who are working on these. I don't think we have a grant writer. We
Yeah.
had one, but we don't have one now.
Yeah, so that varies quite a bit from institution to institution. Some institutions have huge grant writing apparatuses that submit tons of grants,
Right.
and other institutions maybe have one grants person who helps push, submit, and manage the funds, but that's it. So definitely we see a lot of faculty and staff involvement in grant writing process, So that can be a little bit intimidating sometimes. So I'm going to provide some tips and tricks in the next section so that you can kind of get started with that if you haven't done it before. But also know it's kind of a team effort. I very rarely is a grant written in a vacuum of a single person just working on something. Usually it's a large collaborative project that involves the people implementing and the researchers and the finance people and the administration people, and lots of different components play a role.
I've never submitted a grant, so I know.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where starting out the first time can be a little bit scary, but as you get started and get going, you start building up kind of a library of components, and that can make it easier as you keep going. And in a couple of slides, I'll talk about some sections you can get started on, which can also be really helpful. Awesome. So I do want to give a few tips for as you're applying and things to think about. Obviously, every grant application is going to be different because every grant maker has their own things that they want, but there's definitely some commonalities. One thing I do briefly want to note, I mean, everyone here hopefully already knows this, but grant makers are not interested in funding just technology. So if you find a new technology you're excited about, that's great. But they're really looking for what I like to call the warm fuzzy feelings. So why do you want that technology? What is it going to facilitate? How is it going to help those areas I talked about at the beginning of the session? Things like student learning outcomes, workforce development, faculty research. And most grants are written for those warm fuzzy feelings. And so that's what you're going to see, and that's what you're going to find. And technology is just going to play a smaller role. So make sure that you know what you want to do with the technology before you go out looking for a grant for it. Other things to note, your budget justification is going to be super important. So thinking about what pieces of technology or other equipment you're including, how is that going to enable those grant funded activities? That's what the grant maker cares about. They don't care about how fancy the equipment is. They care about what is it going to facilitate and how is it going to help you get your students engaged or something like that. And also remember to involve your vendors and your IT staff. So many horror stories of forgotten dongles and widgets and all sorts of components. So nobody wants to be told after you want a grant that, oh, actually it's going to cost another $20,000 to implement it. So definitely have those conversations ahead of time, and then you'll have really accurate numbers to include in your budgets. And then it also means that you'll know the real price. So then the grant maker is going to know that you did your homework. So in terms of some tips, as I just said, grants fund projects, not products. So make sure you think about that comprehensive overall project. And sometimes that's even more than just the learning innovation that you have an idea about. Sometimes that also means you need to provide wraparound services, or you need to connect to other departments or something like that. So make sure you're thinking about all the components that would go into it, and not getting short-sighted on just one thing, because your application will be a lot more competitive if you're considering that well-rounded overall comprehensive project. Make sure any project needs and objectives are what determine the technology and other equipment that you're acquiring. As I mentioned, most grant makers are not excited about the technology, so definitely make sure that you think about what it is that it's going to be enabling, and then picking the best equipment to do that, instead of picking the best equipment and then trying to work backwards. You're going to want to utilize your local and regional statistics to illustrate themes or identify challenge areas with your students. The grant makers are always excited by data because, one, it shows you did your homework, and two, it shows that somebody else said that this problem is real. So if you can find data from your registrar at an institute of higher education, for example, or maybe your local town or county has employment data or labor statistics or economic data or something like that, maybe the Department of Labor in your state or federal level agency can provide some data about what's going on in terms of fields that are really in demand, or where they're projecting growth in the next 10 years or something like that. Anytime you can provide that data, it's going to be very compelling. And also on the flip side, if you have already done a mini version of a project you're proposing for a grant, if you can show that it was successful in the mini version with data, then the grant maker is going to be more convinced that you're ready for a larger scale project. Involve your vendors to gather those accurate quotes. Make sure you have all that necessary gear, as I mentioned. lots of horror stories about things not being all together and all right. But also you're going to have really accurate numbers, so you know how much it's actually going to cost, not how much the internet says it's going to cost. And then also you can include those vendor quotes with your budget justification when necessary, because then it shows again that you did your homework and you're really prepared for this project. And you're also showing the real numbers, not just round numbers that the grant maker doesn't know if they're real or if they're just a guess. Learn as much as possible about the grant program before you apply. I mean, I just mentioned a few programs, but don't apply for them just by listening to what I said. Go and look at solicitations, watch webinars. A lot of grant makers do webinars. Read the FAQs. There are so many things in FAQs that are never mentioned anywhere else, but those can be super important. Talk to other people, look at awarded projects, and then if you still have questions, talk to the program manager. Most grant programs have a contact, in which case, talk to them if you have questions. Show that you've done your homework and you're not asking a question that can be easily answered. So don't contact them and say, hey, when is the grant in October going to be due, when it says right on the project page that it's due on October 10th or something like that. But if you've done your homework and you're asking them a question that hasn't already easily been answered, they are happy to talk to you and they will tell you as much as they can. They can't always say things that they've been told are secret about internal processes and thoughts, but they can certainly steer you in particular directions and they can clarify things. And they're just really lovely people as a whole, so they will be happy to talk to you. So think about all of those kinds of things before you ever think about putting pen to paper so that you know you're really ready. When you're developing your goals, make sure they're SMART goals. So specific, measurable, achievable, results-focused, and time-bound. So specific, make it actually just about this project. Don't make your goals be grand overall themes where your goal is like, I'm going to completely change the student body and makeup of STEM education in the entire country. While that's very ambitious and exciting, it doesn't fit exactly what your project is. So make sure it's exactly about your project, and that's really what they care about. Make sure it's measurable. In this case, that means attach a number to it. So be able to say, I expect to see a 10% increase in the number of students who pass the class, or I expect to see a increase of 40 students attending this kind of session or knowing XYZ skill or something like that, so that you can, at the end of the project, say, I did this or I didn't do this. That's what the grant maker is going to want to know. Make sure it's achievable. Don't set overly ambitious goals. So again, don't make them something you know you can't do. If you are an institution with 1,000 students, don't say you plan to have 1,500 students at the end of the project, because the grant maker is going to know that's not realistic and they're going to think you didn't do your homework. Make it results focused. Make it really about what are you going to achieve and how is that going to help with whatever challenge you mentioned at the beginning, because that's what they really care about. And also make it time bound. Your project that you're proposing has a specific length of time. Most grant makers are going to tell you the maximum length that can be. It's anywhere from 1 to 5 years in most instances. So make sure that everything you're trying to achieve actually can happen in that time period. Because if you're saying, I'm going to do something in 10 years, well, that's after the grant program ended, so they aren't going to know if you did it or not. Make sure to provide a detailed budget justification. Consider every single line item and how is that going to enable the activities that you have planned, and how is those activities going to help accomplish your goals for the project. They want you to connect all those dots. They don't want to have to figure it out on their own. Sometimes if it's too much of a mystery, they're just going to give up and give you a low score. So connect all the dots for them very clearly and say, I need 10 VR headsets because that's going to allow me to have 30 students doing XYZ activity, and that's going to enable them to learn whatever outcome you have planned. That's what you have to say, because then they know that you have it all planned out and that everything you're putting in there makes perfect sense. Don't include any materials beyond those that are specifically requested by the funder. They're not going to look at them. They know what they want, so don't waste your time. Don't waste space. Don't waste the energy. Just give them what they want, because that's what they care about. And get an outside set of eyes to edit your proposal and provide feedback. You know what you want it to say, which sometimes means when you read it, you think that's what it says. That's not always true. So have somebody who is outside your project read through it. They'll catch things like spelling and grammar, but more importantly, they're going to catch places where things are not clear, or where they don't know what your project is actually going to be, or perhaps where you're not answering the question the grant maker asked, you were just answering a related question. All of those things are really important. When we think about who's reviewing grant applications, they're typically educated individuals who have some amount of expertise in a relevant area. Don't assume that they're super experts in your exact specific topic, because they probably aren't. But they are going to be people who have some amount of expertise. So think about writing. I tend to say aim for something like an upper undergraduate student kind of thing, who's taking a class that maybe is not in their major, but they know a bunch of stuff already. So think about writing it that way. Avoid all that jargon and extra extraneous analogies, things like that. Make sure to focus on telling them exactly what they need to know to understand why your project's important. And lastly, follow directions. It sounds super obvious, but grant makers write a lot of instructions, and if you don't follow them, they will just throw out your application and not read it. In some estimations, that might be 20% of applications that are never even looked at because they don't follow the instructions. You don't want to be in that group. So make sure to follow all those instructions. Give them the font size they want, give them the margins they want, give them the amount of content they want, include all those attachments, don't include extra attachments. It also shows that you're detail oriented, which is going to make them believe that you can implement the project you're promising to implement. A grant application operates much like a contract. So once they say they're going to fund it, that turns into an actual contract where you're promising you're going to do what you said you were going to do with the money that they give you. So make sure that it's actually achievable and that you're actually going to follow it, but then also follow those directions so that they know that you will actually do the things you said you were going to do. So with that, any other questions?
Do you have any tips on how to find grants?
Yeah, so finding grants can be sometimes challenging. Obviously, the internet tells you some answers. In the US, there's something called grants.gov, and this is a clearinghouse of every federal grant. Every federal agency is required to post all of their grants there. It's not always the most user-friendly for searching, to be completely honest, but it can be a really good place to start. Also look at agency websites. So grants.gov, as well as other places on the internet, will tell you what the interests are of each of these agencies, so you might be able to narrow it down. So if you know that you're really interested in STEM education, you're probably going to look at Department of Education, or you're going to be looking at National Science Foundation. So then you can kind of cut out a lot of other options. There's some instances, if you're connecting to like aerospace or national security or something, you might be looking elsewhere. But for the majority of them, those would be the two agencies you're looking at. So sometimes that can help narrow down that scope so that it's less overwhelming. State agency websites are also good places to look. Some states have their own clearinghouses, like grants.gov, some don't. And internationally, the same kind of thing. Foundations can be a little bit more tricky, so sometimes it's searching for names of foundations, or you can search for foundations for corporations who do relevant work to what you are interested in. So think about a corporation that does something in a related area. So if you're interested in education related to energy, maybe you're looking at energy providers and their foundations. And then also think about families who have personal ties to something that you're interested in, particularly prominent families, or maybe they are prominent in as individuals in your community. So that can also be a good place to look.
I was just gonna say, it seems like it would be easier if someone came up with a template where they would say, just follow this template, so it's always the same size font, same size, whatever.
Yeah, that would be so much easier, but they don't do that. Every grant maker wants something different. Some individual grant makers will make a semi-template for their grant. So National Science Foundation has something called the PAPPG, which is Policies and Procedures Application Guide. And so that's like the general rules that you follow for all of their applications. And then each specific program, their RFP just lists the exceptions to that. So that's kind of as close as you get on that kind of standard form. But we are going to talk about some of those common components where even if it's not the right format, you can start developing some materials that you can kind of use across the board, which can help. Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about formalizing grant seeking. So grant readiness is all about making sure you have those common proposal elements and organizational structures in place long before you even start a grant application. Most grant applications, the RFP is released 30 to 90 days before it's due. That sounds like a long time, but all of us have a lot of other things going on in our lives. So it's not that long to start a project from scratch and be able to write a whole plan. So being able to get some of these pieces in place and getting your ducks in a row before you actually get an RFP can make you better prepared once it comes out. So there are a bunch of different components that are showing up in almost every grant application that you're doing. Exactly what it looks like tends to change from organization to organization and program to program, but the pieces are going to be the same. So it's just rearranging them and then editing them a little bit and helping to meet the specific needs at that point. So first off, every project you do, you know you're going to have a statement of need because that's why you're doing the project. If you don't have a need, why are you doing it in the first place? Also, know your target population. Who are you actually trying to serve? And try to get statistics about them ahead of time, whether it's about them specifically or about the need connected to that target population. That can be really beneficial. Think about your project description. There's going to be a bunch of things that you're going to need. You're going to need your goals. You're going to need your activities. You're going to need your timeline, and you're going to need your outcome. You know all of those things are going to happen because that's what makes up a project, is those 4 components. A logic model I mentioned on here, that's a way of representing those components that some grant applications require. It's a specific format. So sometimes it's helpful to think in that kind of format if you're familiar with logic models, but if you aren't and the grant program doesn't require it, I wouldn't stress too much about that. Think about your evaluation plan. This is how you're saying you did what you promised to do. So think about that ahead of time as well. And also, do you need to bring in a partner who could do that evaluation piece if you or your organization is not prepared to do it? Start thinking about your budget. I mentioned talking to vendors. But also talk to your internal finance people. If you're including salaries, you're going to need to know what is the percentage that calculates for fringe and other benefits. If you are dealing with federal grants in the US, there's something called an indirect cost rate. You're going to need to know how your specific institution calculates that, or if you have a calculated rate. All of those things play a role. So being able to start preparing those pieces ahead of time can be really helpful. Your sustainability plan is basically how you plan to continue this project once the grant period is over. Grant makers don't want to fund something and then have it disappear. So what is your plan for next? Is it going to be something where once you get it up and running, student tuition will cover the expenses of continuing it? Is it something that you're going to need to find somebody to pay for long term? Do you have another way to make that happen? Think about what that's going to look like. Because grant makers are going to be really sad if you say, I'm going to spend 3 years implementing this project and then I'm going to give it up. Also, gather all that organizational information. So you can't assume that your grant maker knows who you are as an individual or as an organization. It doesn't matter how famous you are. Never make assumptions that they know about you. So think about history of your organization, your strategic plan, your financial info, any certifications, if relevant. Develop those staff bios or CVs or something like that. Get those pieces in place ahead of time because you know you're going to need bits and pieces taken from those. So if you don't have to hunt down the right people when you actually go to put pen to paper, it's going to speed things up a lot. Some grant programs require community needs assessment. If this is a program that's existed before, look at old RFPs, even if the deadline has already passed. If they needed a community needs assessment in the past, probably going to still need one. So get that done because it's going to take more than the 30 to 90 days to make that happen. And then also think about your past successes. You guys are an organization for a reason. So what are grants that you've won and successfully implemented in the past? Do you have testimonials about why you're successful? What are the strengths of your institution? Think about those kinds of things and be able to give specific examples that you could share with the grant maker. And then finally, letters of support. Not every grant program looks for letters of support, but in some instances, it's really helpful to get letters from, say, public officials and companies and things like that. So if that can be something that's beneficial, it's helpful to get those ahead of time so that somebody on vacation who needs to sign something isn't what holds you up. Other things you're going to want to think about, organizational records, as I mentioned, but also your registrations. So in the US, DUNS has now gone away, but you still need your tax ID and your SAM registration and a grants.gov account so you can actually hit submit. And any of those kinds of pieces, you can get that ready at any time, so you might as well do it early and not get stuck. If you're a large organization, you probably have an authorized representative who's allowed to push submit and nobody else is. So figure out who that person is so that you can get them to push submit when the time comes. At some institutions, there are grant seeking and grants management policies that are already in place. Make sure you know what those are. At institutions that have grants offices that actually push the submit button, they probably want all your paperwork 1 to 2 weeks before the deadline. So know that ahead of time so you're not scrambling at the last minute. Think about continual evaluation and what's going to happen if your project is funded. So that can be a really important component. That's also something to talk to your leadership about. If you don't do a lot of grants, you might not already have a plan in place and it might not be an issue. But if you're an organization that does a good amount of grants, it's something to be thinking about. Start forming those partnerships and collaborations as early as possible. Everyone wants to be involved in that project planning period, so make sure you're prepared for that. And then lastly, develop a grants calendar. So I gave some deadlines of a few example programs, but start looking at programs you're interested in and see about when they tend to be due each year or every other year or something like that. And start putting that on a calendar so you'll know ahead of time. And then start working backwards and say 8 weeks before that or 6 weeks before that, I'm going to start writing. And look at a time that you expect to see an RFP released and put that in your grants calendar, working your way back. And you might have to include some other deadlines in there where you say, this is when I need to provide my information to the institution to push submit, or this is when I need to have my project description ready so that an outside person can read it. Think about those things ahead of time and put them on a calendar so that if you're, say, looking at a grant due in January, you will know in September that you want to start getting some pieces put together so that you can be really ready and nothing will sneak up on you. Again, this is kind of an ongoing process. So the more you do grants, the more that's going to work out. Think about who's going to contribute to this project. Does somebody have information within your organization that you're going to need? Does somebody have political sway within the organization that you're going to need? For basically any grant program, you're going to need leadership buy-in. So make sure you or somebody on your team is going to be able to make sure that that happens, because otherwise you're going to be kind of stuck when you get close to the end. And then also, even if it's informal, who on your team is going to be contributing to your grant seeking success? Make sure that you have people from IT and people from curriculum development and leadership and finance offices. And if you have a grants office, all of those kinds of people, you want them all involved. So think about who that's going to be and make sure you're forming those collaborations if you don't already have them, so that those people can provide the information that you need when you need it. And then you're ready to start grant seeking. So you can go out and you can find grant opportunities. I showed you just a very small sampling. There are hundreds of opportunities a year, or thousands of opportunities more accurately, at least in the US. So make sure that you are being strategic in that process. You can't apply for everything. Even if you had nothing else to do with your life, you can't apply for everything. So think really hard about what the best possible fits are. Those are going to be the ones that you really want to focus your time and energy on. When you're starting out, usually my recommendation is to think about maybe one per quarter if you're an individual, and start thinking about that. Is there a foundation or a state grant or a federal grant that you want to apply to in a particular quarter? Maybe work on that, and then the next quarter decide on another one and think about that. That kind of makes it realistic when you have a lot of other competing priorities. Because example of federal grant opportunity, we tend to say start at least 6 to 8 weeks before the deadline, because you're going to have a lot of other things going on, and it's not uncommon for it to take 60 plus hours to get everything put together. So start early, but also start putting those pieces together. So some of that 60 hours happens outside of an RFP open window, so that you are ready to go when you get there. And with that, that's what I wanted to share today. So any questions or things anyone wants to talk about? We're good on the online side? Awesome. Any questions on this side? No pressure either way. Awesome. Well,
And is your organization specifically focused on educational grants? Is that what your role is?
Yeah, so my role specifically is to work with higher education institutions on the grant space as well as research organizations. But my company as a whole handles everything across the nonprofit and public sector spaces. I just can't have expertise in everything. No one person can, so I have colleagues working with like government agencies or healthcare or something.
Would we build that into the grant? Or is it, how is funding for your job?
Yeah, so you can't actually build it into the grant. You have, because those are called pre-award costs. So all costs for grant programs must happen after they say yes. So you can't actually start a project until after they say yes. So that means that for my company, it would be payment on a consulting basis. We have different kinds of arrangements depending on what you need. But that's something that has to kind of come out of a general fund or something like that, with the hope that overall it's going to be increasing the amount of funds coming into the institution. It also raises an ethical issue. It's a huge discussion in the grant space.
Sure,
so like grant writers don't get paid also separately outside of a grant if they were to write a grant, because you don't want their payment to come into that
job.
Right, you want them to do a good job because you're paying them to do a good job. You don't want them to like tie it into some long-term something.
Job if I can't get any grants.
Well, that's why you have to do your research ahead of time, right? That's why the grant writers we work with, we know we have they have a proven track record, and a lot of them have worked with these agencies for a really long time, things like that. But yeah. But they get paid the same amount whether you win or lose, but also they get paid a flat rate just by doing the job. It's not tied to how much money you're trying to win.
Right.
It's tied to the complexity of the application. So then there's no incentive for you to make it smaller or larger. You're doing the exact projects that you need to do, and your budget is going to reflect the exact project you need to do.
And obviously some of those grants include personnel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so you are potentially hiring people through the grant to complete some of the objectives or goals, whatever.
Sometimes you're hiring people, sometimes you're paying part of salaries of people that already exist.
Yeah.
So if you plan to have, say, a faculty member redevelop a course that they're teaching, maybe that course is one of 4 they do. So you figure with their other duties, maybe that's 20% of their total time.
Yeah.
So then you might charge 20% of their time to the grant. And that would be how it was paid, to pay that portion of that person. Also, you would pay, say, grad students or undergrads or lab managers or whoever is relevant to a particular project. Sometimes that's a component of a salary, not necessarily always a full salary. Awesome. Any final questions today? All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.